The man who fell from his horse and into Rosa Boone's life arrived on a Tuesday in the autumn of 1882, bleeding from a wound in his side and burning with a fever that would have killed a lesser man within the week. Rosa had been out behind her small homestead near the edge of Copper Creek, New Mexico territory, hauling water from the well because the old rope on the pump had frayed through again, when she heard the sound of hooves stumbling rather than striking the earth with purpose. She set down her bucket and shielded her eyes against the hard afternoon sun. The rider was slumped forward over the neck of a black horse that was lathered white with exhaustion, and when the animal finally stopped at the edge of her fence line, it stood trembling like a man asked to hold up the sky. Rosa did not hesitate. She was 24 years old, a widow of 11 months, the daughter of a woman who had trained under a Mexican curandera, and she had buried her fear of trouble somewhere alongside her husband Edgar the previous winter. She crossed the dry yard in quick strides, caught the horse by its bridle before the animal could bolt, and pressed her hand against the stranger's shoulder. "Hey," she said firmly. "Hey, can you hear me?" The man groaned. He turned his head just enough for her to see a square jaw thick with several days of dark beard, sun-darkened skin, and eyes that were somewhere between green and gray and could not decide which, though at the moment they were glassy and fixed on nothing. "I need to get down," he said, and his voice was low and ragged and carried the particular dignity of a man who was not accustomed to needing help from anyone. "You are going to fall," she told him plainly. "I know it," he said. He fell. She caught as much of him as she could, which was not much because he was a broad-shouldered, long-limbed man of at least 30 years, and she was a lean woman who stood 5 feet and 4 inches on a good day. But she slowed his descent enough that he hit the ground without cracking his skull, and she dragged him by the arms toward her porch with a grunting, determined effort that left furrows in the dry dirt. His shirt was soaked through, on the right side, with blood that had dried to a rust color at the edges, and was still slow and dark at the center. She cut the fabric away with her sewing scissors once she had him on the narrow cot in her back room, the room she had once been meaning to make into a proper parlor. The wound was from a bullet that had passed clean through, which was fortunate, but it had been left untended long enough to begin turning against him, and the fever that radiated off his skin was the kind that had to be fought from the outside as well as from within. Rosa built up the stove, boiled water, and set to work with the calm efficiency of a woman who had watched her mother clean wounds by lamplight more times than she could count. She packed the entry and exit wounds with a poultice of yarrow and calendula from the bundles of dried herbs that hung along her kitchen ceiling, then wrapped the whole of it in strips of clean linen she had been saving for emergencies precisely like this one. She found his saddlebags after she had settled him and gone back to tend to his horse, which she led to her small corral and fed a measure of oats from her own dwindling supply. The bags were heavy. When she opened them only far enough to search for any document that might tell her his name, she felt the weight of coin without looking for it, and closed them again, and set them inside the house without counting what was there. That was not her business yet. His name she found on a folded letter tucked inside his vest pocket, addressed to Mr. Clayton McCrae, care of the McCrae Land and Cattle Company, Silver Rock, New Mexico Territory. She had heard of Silver Rock. Everyone in the territory had heard of Silver Rock. It was 40 miles northeast of Copper Creek, a proper town built around a cattle empire that shipped beef north to the railhead at Santa Fe and east as far as Texas. She had heard the name McCrae attached to that operation, spoken in the way people spoke names that had grown larger than the men who bore them. But the man on her cot did not look like an empire. He looked like a person in considerable pain who needed water and broth and someone to make sure he did not die in the night, and so that was what Rosa gave her attention to. She sat with him through the dark hours, replacing cool cloths on his forehead, coaxing water between his cracked lips whenever he surfaced enough to swallow, and listening to the way the desert settled into its own particular nighttime stillness. Coyotes called from somewhere distant. The black horse shifted in the corral. The lamp burned low and she trimmed the wick and kept watch. He spoke once in the deep of the night, not quite to her and not quite to no one. "Tell Harlan to check the eastern fence," he said, in a voice that was clear and commanding even through the fever. "Before the first frost. Tell him now." "I will tell him," Rosa said quietly, because sometimes a person just needed to hear that their words had been received. He subsided again, and she watched his chest rise and fall, and thought about the particular strangeness of being alone in a house with a man you did not know, nursing him toward life with the same careful attention you might give a sick calf or a seedling, not because you were required to, but because turning away had never been a thing she was built for. By the third day, the fever broke. She was at the stove when she heard the change in his breathing, and she came to the doorway and found him awake, truly awake, his eyes focused on the low ceiling of her back room with an expression of careful assessment. "You are in Copper Creek," she said before he could ask. "My name is Rosa Boone. You fell off your horse onto my fence line 3 days ago." He turned his head slowly toward her. The gray-green eyes moved over her face with an attention that she felt as a physical thing, unhurried and direct. "Clayton McCrae," he said. "I know," she said. "There was a letter." He was quiet for a moment. "How bad? The wound is healing, the fever is gone. You lost a great deal of blood and you were not sensible enough to stop and let someone help you before you rode yourself into the ground." She said it without heat, simply as a statement of the facts as she understood them. "I needed to get distance," he said, "from whoever shot you." "Yes." She nodded, accepting this, and went to heat the broth she had made from a bone and the last of her dried vegetables. She brought it to him in a tin cup and helped him sit up enough to drink it, and she noticed the way he set his jaw against the pain of moving and did not make a sound about it. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked. "I should know if I am expecting trouble at my door." He looked at her steadily. "You are not. It was a dispute over land boundaries 2 counties over. The man who did it is not going to follow me here. He has too much to lose by drawing more attention to himself." A pause. "I should have stayed to deal with it instead of riding." "You were shot," she pointed out. "I have been shot before," he said, and from his tone she understood this to be literally true. She took the cup back when he had finished the broth and gave him water and told him to sleep. And he did, with the obedient exhaustion of a body that had been running on pure stubbornness and had finally been given permission to rest. Over the days that followed, Rosa learned Clayton McCrae in the slow and particular way you learn a person who is dependent on your care. She learned that he woke early regardless of how weak he was, that he disliked accepting help with things he felt he could do himself even when doing them himself was plainly foolish, that he had a dry and spare sense of humor that emerged in moments when he thought she was not expecting it, and that he watched everything around him with the attentive precision of a man who had spent a long time needing to understand his surroundings quickly. She learned that he asked questions that were genuinely curious rather than merely polite, that he listened to the answers with his full attention rather than waiting for his turn to speak, and that he never once treated her small homestead or her plainly practical life with even a flicker of condescension. She did not learn until later exactly what it meant that his name was attached to Silver Rock. On the 5th day, he was well enough to sit up on his own and swing his legs over the side of the cot, though she came in to find him pale-faced and gripping the edge of the frame with white knuckles. "You are going to open the wound if you push it," she said from the doorway. "I need to send word to my ranch," he said. "They will be looking for me." "I sent word 2 days ago," she said. "I rode to Copper Creek and asked the telegraph operator to send to Silver Rock that Clayton McCrae was alive and recovering at the Boone homestead on the Copper Creek South Road." He stared at her. It was a particular kind of stare she would come to recognize that he deployed when something surprised him more than he expected. "You did not need to do that," he said finally. "No," she agreed, "but your people needed to know, and you were in no condition to tell them yourself." Something moved through his expression that she did not quite know how to name. He looked down at his hands, which were large and were cruffined, and had the particular calluses of a man who did not merely own a ranch but worked one. "Thank you," he said, and he said it in a way that made the words weighty and specific rather than merely courteous. "You are welcome," she said, and brought him breakfast. A rider came from Silver Rock on the 6th morning, a lean young man named Denny who arrived in a cloud of dust and nearly fell off his horse in his relief at finding his employer alive. He had a saddlebag full of supplies from the ranch and a letter that he pressed into Clayton's hand with visible urgency. Rosa gave Denny coffee and let him sit at her table while Clayton read the letter in the back room. When Clayton called for her, she went and found him sitting with the letter in his lap and an expression on his face that was carefully composed over something she thought might be anger. "Harlan has been trying to reach me because there was a secondary dispute over the eastern boundary," he said, and Rosa remembered the words he had spoken in his fever and did not say so. "I need to get back." "You need another week at minimum before you ride," she said flatly. "I can take a wagon. A wagon over 40 miles of territory road will shake that wound open just as surely." He looked at her with the expression of a man testing whether the argument was going to be worth having. "A week," she said again, and held his gaze. His mouth curved very slightly at one corner. "A week," he said. He sent Denny back with a letter and instructions, and the ranch settled itself temporarily in his absence, and Clayton remained in Rosa's back room and then, as he strengthened, on her porch where the air was better and the light did not have the closed-in quality of four walls. It was on the porch that they truly began to know each other. He asked her about the homestead, how long she had been there, how she managed it alone, and she told him about Edgar, told him plainly because she did not see the point in being coy about it, that her husband had died of pneumonia the previous winter, and she had been running the property by herself since, tending the kitchen garden, keeping a small flock of chickens, doing washing and mending for 3 other families in the area to supplement what the garden produced. She watched his face as she said it. He did not look at her with pity, which she appreciated deeply, having spent 11 months absorbing other people's pity like a dry cloth absorbs water, uselessly and without benefit. "That is a hard thing," he said, simply and without embellishment. "It is," she agreed. "You learn what you are capable of." "What were you capable of?" She considered this honestly. "More than I knew," she said, "and less than I sometimes needed." She paused. "But I am still here." He looked out at the yard, at the small corral where his black horse, whose name she had learned from Denny was Cassidy, stood companionably with her old bay. "Yes," he said, "you are." He told her, in the gradual way of a man who was not accustomed to talking about himself, about Silver Rock and what it had taken to build it. His father had come to New Mexico from Texas in 1861 with 100 head of cattle and a stubbornness that had functioned as capital when real capital ran out, and Clayton had grown up on that land through the bloody years of the territory wars, through the Lincoln County unpleasantness that was still not entirely settled in people's memories, and had taken over the operation at 22 when his father's health had begun to fail. He did not tell her the size of the operation. He spoke about it as work, as a thing that required daily attention and constant problem-solving, and she would not have guessed from his manner that it was anything more than a moderately successful cattle ranch, because he spoke about it the way a man who truly loves his work speaks, with specificity and occasional frustration, and the underlying satisfaction of a thing that is fundamentally his own. She would learn the scale of it later, and when she did, she would understand why he had not mentioned it, because she would have begun treating him differently if she had known, and he would have seen it in her face, and she understood that he had been dealing with people treating him differently for a very long time. On the 8th day, he was well enough to walk to the corral without holding the fence rail for support, and she found him there in the early morning talking to Cassidy in a low voice, one hand resting on the horse's neck, and the sight of it did something unexpected to the place behind her sternum that she had largely been ignoring for 11 months. She was standing at the fence watching him before she fully realized she had decided to come stand there, and he turned and saw her, and neither of them said anything for a moment that stretched into something that required acknowledging. "You are better," she said finally. "I am," he agreed. "It is because of you." "It is because you are stubborn enough to refuse to die," she said, and he laughed, a genuine full laugh that she had not heard from him before, and it was a good sound, the kind that made the morning feel wider and lighter. "That may be part of it," he said. She went to stand beside him at the fence and reached out to let Cassidy nose her palm, which the horse had taken to doing over the past several days as a form of greeting. "I will be leaving in 2 days," he said. "My men can bring a wagon that will be well enough sprung to manage the road." She had known this was coming and had been practical about it in her own mind, and so the small drop in her chest surprised her. "Good," she said. "You should be home." "Yes." He turned to look at her. The morning light was full and clear and desert bright, and it found the lines of his face without mercy, the weathered skin around his eyes, the slight asymmetry of a nose that had been broken at some point and set well enough but not perfectly. He was not a beautiful man in any conventional sense, but he was a compelling one, and Rosa was honest enough with herself to have noticed this some days ago. Rosa. It was the first time he had used her given name, and she noticed that too, the particular sound of it in his voice. "What will you do," he said, "when winter comes, alone here?" The question was asked simply, without agenda that she could hear, and she answered it as honestly as he had asked it. "What I did last winter," she said, "and the winter before. You should not be alone out here. There are a great many things about my situation that are not ideal," she said, looking at him steadily. "But I am not asking for rescue." He held her gaze. "I know you are not," he said quietly. "That was not what I meant." The moment held something between them that she was not ready to give a name to. And then Cassidy pushed his nose against her shoulder, and they both stepped back slightly from the edge of whatever it had been. The wagon came from Silver Rock on the 10th day, driven by Denny and accompanied by 2 other ranch hands. And when Rosa watched them load Clayton's things with the brisk efficiency of men who were glad to be retrieving their employer in one piece, she felt the homestead adjust around her as if settling back into its solitary shape. Clayton came to her on the porch while his men were seeing to Cassidy, who would be led alongside the wagon on the return. "I want to pay you," he said. "I do not want payment," she said at once. "I know you do not," he said, with that slight curve at the corner of his mouth. "I want it anyway. You kept me alive, and you used your supplies and your time, and I have plenty of money, and you have—" He paused, and she could see him choosing his words with the care of a man who did not want to offend. "You have a fence rail that needs replacing and a kitchen garden that is working harder than it should for a single person's keeping, and your rope pump needs attention. Will you let me send men to fix what needs fixing? Not as payment, as gratitude, which is different." She studied him for a long moment. The distinction he was drawing was a genuine one, she could see that. "The fence rail and the pump rope," she said. "Nothing more." He nodded. "I will send someone by end of week." He held out his hand. She took it. The handshake was firm and direct and lasted a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and when he released her hand he looked at her with the gray-green eyes that were clearer now than they had been since the fever, and she thought she saw something there that was not quite finished. "Thank you," he said, for the second time, and she understood again that he meant it with a weight that the words themselves could barely contain. "Ride carefully," she said, "and let that wound rest." "I will try." "You will do more than try," she said. "I did not nurse you back from the edge of a fever for you to tear everything open on the Silver Rock Road." He smiled then, fully, and it changed his face into something that she felt in a location she was not prepared to examine. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he meant it the way a man means something when he is not joking but is pretending to be. She watched the wagon pull away and stood on the porch until the dust settled, and then she went inside and put a kettle on and sat at her kitchen table and thought very carefully about nothing in particular, which was what she did when she was thinking very carefully about something specific. The men came from Silver Rock 4 days later, 2 of them, with posts and rope and the right tools, and they replaced the fence rail she had been propping with a stick since March and the pump rope that had been fraying since August. And when she offered them lunch, they accepted politely and asked nothing about their employer, and she suspected that was intentional. A week after that, a letter arrived, carried by the postman who made his run from Copper Creek once a fortnight. It was from Clayton McCrae, written in a hand that was clear and direct and slightly cramped in the way of a man who had learned to write practically rather than ornamentally. He wrote that Cassidy had survived the journey without issue. He wrote that the boundary dispute was being handled through proper legal channels, which he expected would resolve it without further incident. He wrote that he hoped she was well. He wrote that Copper Creek was not so far from Silver Rock when you thought about it, and that he had been thinking about it. She read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table, and then she wrote back, because there was no reason not to and several reasons to, and she was not a person who manufactured reasons to do nothing when the genuine reasons to do something were sitting there plainly. She wrote that she was well. She wrote that the pump was working beautifully, and it was a remarkable improvement to her mornings. She wrote that 40 miles was not far at all, when you thought about it, and that she had found herself thinking about it also. She folded the letter and addressed the envelope with the particular care of a woman who was not at all sure what she was doing but was doing it anyway, and she walked it to Copper Creek herself rather than wait for the postman. The letter that came back arrived in 5 days, faster than it should have been possible given the normal postal schedule, and she understood from this that he had found a more direct means of conveyance. He wrote that he would like to call on her, if she would permit it, the following Saturday. She wrote back that Saturday would be suitable. He arrived on a fresh horse, not Cassidy, a bay mare named Adelaide who he introduced by name as if Rosa might want to know, which she did. He arrived at noon and stayed until the sun was 3 hours from the horizon, and they sat on her porch and talked with the ease of people who had already spent 10 days in the forced intimacy of illness and recovery, and had therefore skipped several of the usual preliminary stages of acquaintance. He had brought food, not gifts exactly but provisions, a sack of coffee and a round of hard cheese and a paper parcel of smoked ham, and he set these on her table when he came in and did not make anything of it, and she appreciated the practical manner of it because it meant she did not have to navigate the social performance of either accepting or declining graciously. They talked about the territory. He told her about the changes he had watched come to New Mexico in the 20 years he had been old enough to notice them, the way the cattle industry had organized itself, and then reorganized itself around the railroad, the way the town of Silver Rock had grown from a trading post and a saloon into a place with a schoolhouse and a church and a proper mercantile that sold fabric and canned goods and seed catalogs from the East. She told him about what Copper Creek had been like when she and Edgar had come there 6 years earlier, the smallness of it, the particular isolation of a homestead life that was nothing like the settlements she had read about in the newspaper articles that made the West sound like a great adventure rather than a great quantity of daily work. She told him about the small satisfaction she had found there, the kitchen garden that produced beautifully in good years, the neighbors who were few but reliable, the way the desert changed color in the evening and could still, after 6 years, produce a sunset that made her stop whatever she was doing and simply look. He listened. He always listened with that full, unhurried attention, and she found herself saying more than she had intended to say, not because she was careless, but because there was something about his manner of receiving words that made you want to give him more of them. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. By the 5th visit, the quality of the silences between them had changed into something easier and more deliberate, the silences of 2 people who had enough to say to each other that they did not need to fill every moment, and Rosa, who had spent 11 months in a silence that was simply absence, felt the difference like the difference between an empty room and a room that was resting. On the 6th Saturday, he did not leave at sunset. The evening had turned cool early, and she had invited him to supper rather than watch him ride 40 miles in the dark on the thin excuse that the conversation was not finished. And they had eaten at her small kitchen table with the lamp between them, and afterwards sat in the chairs she had moved inside from the porch, and talked until the lamp needed refilling. When she rose to fill it, she felt him watching her, not with the appraising regard of a man calculating, but with something more open and more careful than that, something that she recognized because she had been watching him in the same way for several weeks and had not yet decided what to do about it. "Rosa," he said. She paused with the oil can in her hand and turned. He was looking at her steadily, elbows on his knees, the way he sat when he was thinking through something important. "I am not a man who is good at indirect speech," he said. "I have been trying to be patient and to do this properly, which I am told involves a certain amount of indirection, but I find I am not built for it." "No," she agreed carefully, setting down the oil can. "I had gathered that." "I have feelings for you that are significant," he said, and the plainness of it was so completely characteristic of him that she felt a sudden rush of something warm and certain that she recognized as the kind of knowing that does not need to argue with itself. "I am not sure of the proper, I am not sure what the appropriate." He stopped, ran a hand across his jaw. "I would like to court you, properly, if you are willing." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had fallen out of the sky and onto her fence line, who had been too stubborn to die and too honest to be indirect, who had sat on her porch for 6 consecutive Saturdays asking questions and listening to the answers and laughing at the right moments, and who was looking at her now with an expression of careful, genuine uncertainty that she had not seen on his face before. "I am willing," she said. Something moved through his expression that was almost relief, as if he had not been entirely certain of the outcome, and this, more than anything else, made her trust the whole of it. "Good," he said, and then the slight smile. "Good." She filled the lamp and they talked until well past 10, and when he finally rode out into the cool night on Adelaide, she stood on the porch and watched the darkness swallow him up, and felt the homestead settle around her in a shape that was, she thought, beginning to change. The courtship that followed was earnest and unhurried and occasionally awkward in the specific ways that two self-sufficient people in their 30s, neither of whom was new to loss or to the management of their own lives, are awkward when they begin the complicated project of making room for another person. He brought her books from Silver Rock, a thing she had not expected, novels and a natural history of the Southwest, and a political pamphlet about land rights that led to a spirited 2-hour conversation on the porch that ended with both of them slightly flushed and energized in the way of people who have found someone worth arguing with. She taught him, over the course of several visits, to bake the cornbread that her mother had taught her, a process he approached with the focused seriousness he brought to everything, following her instruction with careful precision, and producing on his first attempt a loaf that was better than most she had tasted, which she told him, and which seemed to please him more than she expected. He told her in November about the scope of the McCrae operation, and he told her in the matter-of-fact way of a man reporting facts rather than the performative way of a man trying to impress, and she appreciated the distinction. The ranch ran 40,000 acres. There were 160 employees at last count. The cattle operation shipped to 3 states. There were 2 other properties, one in Texas and one in Colorado. She received this information in the same spirit in which it was delivered, which was to say practically, and then said, "That is a very large operation to manage," which was what she was actually thinking. He said, "It is. It takes more organizing than I sometimes have patience for." And then he had asked her what she thought about a new contract structure he was considering for his seasonal workers, because he had noticed over the previous weeks that she had a methodical and logical mind, and he valued her opinion on problems that required it. She had found herself answering his question with genuine engagement, and somewhere in the middle of working through the problem together, had understood that this was what she had been missing without being able to name it. Not just company, but the specific company of someone whose mind worked alongside hers. In December, the first real cold came down from the mountains, and Clayton arrived on a Saturday morning with a wagon load of split firewood that his men had cut from the McCrae stands, and he spent the better part of the day stacking it against her house, while she made soup and tried not to watch him through the kitchen window more than was reasonable. At noon she brought him out a bowl and they sat on the porch wrapped in their coats, breathing steam into the cold air, and it was the most domestically comfortable she had felt in longer than she could measure. And she thought that he felt it too because he sat there longer than the cold strictly justified, his shoulder close to hers, watching the winter light move across the yard. "I want to ask you something," he said, looking out at the corral where Cassidy and Adelaide stood together, the black horse and the bay, companionable in the cold. He had begun bringing Cassidy again after the first month. "Ask it," she said. He was quiet for a moment that she thought was about finding the words rather than the courage, because she did not think courage was something he lacked. "I have been thinking about what this looks like in the future," he said finally. "What I want it to look like, and I want to know whether you have been thinking about the same thing." She set down her empty bowl on the porch rail and folded her hands in her lap. "I have been thinking about it," she said. And she turned and looked at him. The winter had bleached the light flat, and the cold had brought color to his face, and he was looking at her with those gray-green eyes that she had learned to read over the past months, and what she read in them now was the same careful, genuine thing she had seen on the night he had asked to court her, the expression of a man who did not manipulate outcomes but waited to know them. "I think," she said, "that I would like to stay in the territory I know. I would not want to live on a great ranch in a manner that was nothing like anything I have ever been." He nodded slowly. "I understand that. But I would also like," she said more carefully, "to have someone I trust beside me. I had that once and I know what it is and I know what the absence of it is and I know which one I prefer." He was very still. "I am not proposing to you," she said firmly, because she could see from his expression that he was working out how to respond and she wanted to be clear about what she was and was not doing. "No," he said, "I know. But I am telling you that I am not opposed to you proposing to me," she said, "when you are ready to and when it is the right thing. I am telling you so that you have the full information." He looked at her for a long moment, and then that smile appeared, the full one that changed his face, and she felt it in the same reliable location she always did. "That is," he said, "the most practical expression of romantic feeling I have ever encountered." "I am a practical person," she said. "You are," he agreed. "I find it extraordinary." They looked at each other in the cold December light, and then he reached over and covered her folded hands with one of his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the winter quiet for a long time while the horses stood together in the corral, and the dry grass along the fence line rustled in the wind that came down from the mountains. He proposed in January, on a Sunday rather than a Saturday, because the Sunday had felt necessary to him in some way he had not fully explained. He had ridden out in the early morning when the frost was still on the ground, and the sky was the particular pale color it turned in January before the sun committed to the day. He knocked at her door, which he had never done before, always having announced himself from the fence line, and when she opened it, she saw immediately that he had dressed with more care than usual and was holding his hat in his hand in the manner of a man performing an official occasion. She took one look at him and the thing that was in his expression and said, "Come in," before he had said anything at all, because the cold was serious and because she wanted to hear whatever he had come to say somewhere that was warm. He came in and stood in her kitchen and looked at her and said, "Rosa, I am in love with you. I have been for some time. I would like to marry you, if you are willing, and I would like to make it clear before you answer that I would live here with you in this house if that is what you preferred, or on the ranch if you came to prefer that in time, or somewhere entirely different if we found we both wanted that. I am not asking you to fit yourself into my life. I am asking if we could build one between us." She stood in her kitchen in her plain morning dress with her hair not yet entirely pinned, looking at this man who had fallen onto her property and into her care, and into her life with the particular accidental precision of something that had always been meant to happen. And she thought about all the ways the past year had been hard and hollow, and about the past 4 months which had been, quietly and increasingly, the opposite of that. "Yes," she said. "I am willing." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in his hands with a gentleness that seemed unlikely in hands that size, and kissed her in the pale January light. And she put her hands against his chest, where she could feel his heart going steadily. And the morning outside was cold and still, and the desert was as beautiful as it always was when you remembered to look at it. They were married in March, when the desert began its tentative movement back toward color, in the small church in Copper Creek with the minister who had also presided over Edgar's funeral, who received the news of Rosa's remarriage with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes in the continuity of life and had worried about her. The wedding was small by necessity and by preference. Clayton's foreman Harlan came, a tall, weathered man of 50 who shook Rosa's hand with both of his, and told her gruffly that the boss had not made any sense since October, and he was grateful someone was managing the situation. Several of Rosa's neighbors attended, including the Vega family, who had been the closest thing to regular company she'd had since Edgar's death, and Mrs. Vega cried in the forthright way of a woman who has been hoping for something, and is pleased to see it come to pass. Rosa wore her best dress, which she had let out and taken in and otherwise reworked in the weeks before, until it sat on her the way she wanted it to. And she carried wildflowers because it was March in the desert and wildflowers were what March offered. Clayton wore a clean dark coat and had shaved with particular care, and stood at the front of the church with the composed expression of a man who was very pleased but was keeping it largely internal. And when she walked up the aisle toward him and he saw her, the composed expression became something else entirely, something open and unguarded, and she carried that look with her for a very long time afterward. After the ceremony, they went back to her homestead, which was still hers and which she had been unwilling to simply leave, and had a wedding meal with the guests that she and Mrs. Vega had prepared the day before, and it was loud and warm and full of laughter in the way of gatherings that have been waited for, and are therefore more appreciated than ordinary ones. The question of where they would live had resolved itself over the preceding weeks in the practical and mutually agreeable way that questions between them tended to resolve. She would come to Silver Rock, not because she was surrendering Copper Creek or the person she had made herself there, but because the ranch was a working thing that required its owner's presence, and she was, as she had told him once, capable of more than she knew. She had made him promise that she could return to Copper Creek whenever she wished, that the homestead would remain hers and would not be sold or let to strangers, and he had made this promise without hesitation, because he understood that the homestead was not just land but a kind of testimony to who she was, and he had no interest in erasing it. The drive to Silver Rock 2 days after the wedding was 40 miles through country that Rosa had never traveled all the way across, and she saw the land change from the scrubby high desert around Copper Creek through a long stretch of grassland that opened up in a way that made the sky seem larger, and then the approach to Silver Rock itself, which was a proper town, bigger than she had prepared herself for. The main street had a length to it and a solidity that Copper Creek lacked, buildings of adobe and timber that had been standing long enough to settle into the landscape, a mercantile whose window was full of the kind of goods that she had been sending away for by catalog, a doctor's office, a schoolhouse set back from the road, a bank with a solid stone front. There were people on the street who looked up when the wagon passed, and who, she would come to understand, were looking at her with the specific curiosity of people who knew that Clayton McCrae had married and wanted to assess what kind of woman had accomplished it. She sat straight and met each gaze that came at her, not with challenge but with the simple confidence of a woman who had run a homestead alone for nearly a year and was not going to be made uncertain by the opinions of people who did not yet know her. The ranch itself was another 2 miles beyond the town, and when it came into view, she understood for the first time, at a gut level rather than an intellectual one, what it meant that he had said 40,000 acres. The house was large and low and built to last, adobe walls thick enough to keep out the summer heat and the winter cold, a covered porch that ran the length of the front, outbuildings and corrals, and a bunkhouse that was the size of a small hotel. There were men working in the corrals and along the fence lines, and several of them stopped and took their hats off as the wagon came in, and she saw in this gesture both respect for their employer and a kind of welcoming acknowledgement of her that was more genuine than she had expected. Harlan was waiting on the porch, and he came down to help with the wagon and shook her hand again, and told her that the house had been aired out, and he hoped everything was where she would want it, which indicated that someone had been thinking about her comfort in advance, and she suspected this had been Clayton's doing rather than his own. The inside of the house was furnished plainly but well, the furniture solid and built for use rather than display, the floors clean, the kitchen large and equipped with a stove that was considerably newer and more sophisticated than the one she had been managing in Copper Creek, and she spent the first afternoon learning its particular characteristics, while Clayton dealt with the accumulated business of 2 weeks away from the ranch. That evening they sat on the long porch as the sun went down over the mountains, and the sky turned the particular shades that the desert specialized in, the lavenders and deep oranges, and the specific rose that appeared for perhaps 15 minutes at the very end before the color left the sky entirely. "What do you think?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land that was now also hers, at the scale of it, the cattle in the middle distance, the working machinery of an operation that was larger than anything she had ever been proximate to. "It is a great deal," she said honestly. "I will need time to understand it." "You have time," he said. "I know I do." She looked at him. "I am not frightened of it." "No," he said. "I did not think you would be." She leaned into him, which she was still learning the geography of, the precise way that she fit against his side, and he put his arm around her and they watched the last of the color leave the sky, and the stars came out in the desert way, quickly and completely, as if they had been there all along and had simply been waiting for the light to get out of the way. The first months at Silver Rock were a process of becoming fluent in a new language. Rosa was not a woman who sat in a house and allowed the world outside to proceed without her, and she made herself useful in the ways that interested her and that did not step on the work of people who had been doing their jobs for years and did not need her involvement. She reorganized the kitchen garden, which had been maintained by whoever had time, and had accordingly developed the haphazard character of something that no one was responsible for, and planted it with the same methodical attention she had given her Copper Creek garden, and by summer it was producing in a way that made the cook, an older man named Aurelio who had been feeding ranch hands for 20 years, look at it with the expression of a man revising an opinion he had not known he held. She sat in on the meetings when the territory land attorney came out to discuss the ongoing boundary case, not because she had been invited, but because she had asked, and Clayton had said of course without hesitation, and she had followed the legal arguments with sufficient attention that afterward she had asked a question that the attorney had taken a full minute to consider before acknowledging was a very good one. After that she was always invited. She learned the names of all the hands. This took time and effort, and she made mistakes, but she persisted, because she had grown up in a world where people worked for wages that did not always reflect what the work was worth. And she had thoughts about that which she shared with Clayton, and which led to several long and animated conversations that ended, more than once, with adjustments to the way the ranch compensated its workers. The land attorney, a Mr. Beaumont from Santa Fe, made a remark once that reached her second hand through Harlan, that Mrs. McCrae was perhaps not what had been expected. She received this report and stored it without offense, because she understood that Silver Rock had been a world built by and for men of a certain type, and that a woman who asked legal questions and reorganized the labor structure was going to require some adjustment of expectation. She did not require anyone's permission to be what she was. She simply continued being it. The boundary dispute was resolved in the spring of 1883 in Clayton's favor through a combination of proper documentation and the legal argument that had been painstakingly assembled over the preceding months. The man who had shot Clayton did not come back into any story that required dealing with, having removed himself to Texas and enough trouble of his own to keep him occupied, and Rosa watched this resolution come to pass with the satisfaction of seeing a thing finished. She went back to the Copper Creek homestead in April of that year, the first time since the wedding, riding out with Clayton on a clear morning. She had wanted to see it in the spring, when the desert was as close to lush as it got, and she had wanted to see it with him rather than alone, which felt like the right ordering of things. It was smaller than she remembered, which she had expected. It had the slightly forlorn quality of an uninhabited place that had not yet decided whether it was waiting or giving up, and she walked through the rooms and touched the familiar surfaces of her old life. The kitchen table she had sat at alone for nearly a year, the window above the basin where she had watched the sky in the mornings, the back room where a man had recovered from a bullet wound and a fever, and had, in the process, turned her life in a direction she had not planned for but could not now. Imagine having missed. She stood in the doorway of that room for a moment, and Clayton stood behind her and did not say anything because he understood, she thought, what she was doing there. "Thank you," she said quietly, to the room, to the homestead, to the particular chapter of her life that had happened here and was now completed. "Ready?" Clayton said. "Yes," she said, and meant it in all the ways it could be meant. They rode back to Silver Rock in the afternoon light, side by side, and she felt the fullness of her life settle around her like something that had been waiting to fit properly and had finally found its shape. It was in the summer of 1883 that Rosa discovered she was expecting a child. She realized it quietly and on her own, the way she tended to come to important understandings, sitting with it for several days before she told Clayton on a Sunday evening when they were on the porch, and the light was long and golden, and the land was at its most peaceable. She told him plainly, because she was always plain with him, and watched his face do something that she had not seen it do before, which was to lose entirely the composure that he maintained in most circumstances. He looked at her and then looked away and then looked back, and she could see him working through a feeling that was larger than his usual management of things. "Rosa," he said. "I know," she said. He took her hand very carefully, as if she had suddenly become something fragile which she had not, and told him so, but she let him hold the hand anyway because the instinct behind it was a good one. "When?" he asked. "February," she said. He looked out at the ranch, at the land in the evening light, and she could see him thinking about the future in the way he thought about large-scale problems, comprehensively and with attention to every element. "We will need to make arrangements," he said. "We have time," she said. "I am fine, Clayton. I am not unwell." He looked back at her. "I know you are fine," he said. "I know." But his hand tightened on hers in a way that told her the knowing was theoretical, and the feeling was something else. She sat with him in the easy and comfortable way they had developed, her head against his shoulder, his arm around her, and thought about a February that would change the shape of their life again, and found that the prospect of it made the evening feel larger and more full of possibility than even the best evenings had before. The autumn passed in the ordinary business of the ranch, the fall roundup that brought everyone on the property to full working capacity, the cattle drive north to the railhead, the accounts that needed settling and the contracts that needed reviewing. Rosa, in the early months of her pregnancy when she had more energy than she would have later, threw herself into the account's work with a thoroughness that rendered them cleaner and more legible than they had been in years. And the accountant who came from Santa Fe to review them looked at her with an expression of bewildered appreciation that she found privately entertaining. Harlan observed her energy and her efficiency, and made a remark to Clayton that was reported back to her later by one of the kitchen hands, which was that the boss had married someone with more sense than the whole of the board of directors, and that this was a fortunate circumstance. She liked Harlan for this, which she had been doing gradually in any case, because underneath his gruff and practical exterior was a man who respected competence above everything else, and this she had in common with him. The baby arrived on the 14th of February, 1884, which given the date seemed like the kind of thing you could not have planned and therefore had to simply accept as a gift from the particular sense of humor of whatever ordered events in the world. He was a boy, healthy and dark-haired, and possessed from his first hour of a set of opinions about his circumstances that he expressed at high volume without hesitation. Clayton held him with the same focused seriousness he brought to everything that was important and new, and looked down at the infant's face with an expression that Rosa stored in her heart alongside the expression she had seen on his face in the church in Copper Creek the day of their wedding. "What do you want to name him?" Clayton asked. She had been thinking about this for months. "Martin," she said, "after my father." He looked up from the baby's face. His father's name had been William, and she had already told him she did not want to give the child a name that carried obligation rather than love. He had understood this immediately and completely, which had been one of the moments in which she felt most known by him. "Martin McCrae," he said, testing it. "Yes," she said. "Good," he said, and looked back down at Martin, who was regarding him with the vague and profound attention of a very new person encountering his first evidence that the world contained more than one face. Martin was 3 months old when the Vega family from Copper Creek came to visit Silver Rock, the first of what would become a regular occurrence. Elena Vega held the baby and wept, which was entirely in character, and her husband Daniel and Clayton talked cattle prices on the porch while Rosa sat in the kitchen and ate the empanadas that Elena had brought and felt the deep and specific pleasure of old life and new life braided together. The years that followed moved in the rhythm of a working life on a large ranch, which was to say they moved quickly and with the continuous texture of things to be done, and things that happened, an occasional crisis managed, and daily satisfaction taken in work that was real and connected to the land in the direct and unambiguous way that Rosa had always found meaningful. Martin learned to walk at 11 months and spent the following year investigating every corner of the ranch with the methodical intensity of a person conducting a serious survey. And when he was 3, he already had the particular posture of a child who intends to be present wherever things are happening rather than kept safe at a distance, which Rosa recognized as a trait he had inherited from both sides. In 1886, she found that she was expecting again, and this time told Clayton sooner, in part because she had learned that keeping things from him to protect him from worry was not a courtesy he appreciated, and in part because the morning sickness was making it difficult to conduct herself as if nothing was happening. This time it was a daughter, born in October when the desert was in its fall colors, and the air had the particular quality of autumn in New Mexico, cool and clear and smelling of sage and distance. They named her Alice, after no one in particular, because both of them agreed she should have a name that was entirely her own. Alice was from her first days a child of strong preferences and clear communication, louder and more socially confident than Martin had been, and the two children together created a household dynamic that was, at its best, deeply alive, and, at its more trying moments, educational in ways that Rosa had not anticipated. She thought often in those years about the particular improbability of the life she was living. She had come to New Mexico territory as a young bride with a husband who was honest and kind, and had worked himself to death trying to build something in hard country. And she had buried him and spent a year alone, and had been on the verge of a winter that she had been genuinely not certain how to survive. And then a stranger had fallen off his horse onto her fence line. She thought about the version of herself who had dragged that stranger across the yard without knowing who he was, without any purpose beyond the fact that a person was injured and needed help, and she was someone who could provide it. She had not done it because of any calculation about outcomes. She had done it because it was what you did when you were the kind of person she was. And the outcome, which she had not been calculating, had been this. Had been Clayton sitting across the kitchen table from her, with Martin on his knee and Alice attempting to climb his leg from the floor. Laughing at something Martin had said with the full, unguarded laugh that she had first heard on that morning at the fence line, and had been collecting ever since. In 1887, there was a drought that was hard on cattle operations across the territory, and the McCrae Ranch took losses that were significant but not catastrophic, in part because Rosa had read about similar conditions further east and had been urging for 6 months that they diversify what the land was used for in ways that did not depend entirely on cattle. Clayton had taken her counsel, and they had put in hay on a section of the eastern range that turned out to be the section that held its water best. And the hay sold well that autumn to ranchers who had nothing to feed their herds. The drought was the year they talked most seriously about what the ranch would be in 20 years, and what role both of them would play in it. And it was in these conversations that the nature of their partnership became most clearly itself. She was not an appendage to his operation. She was a partner in the full sense, with her own analysis and her own areas of knowledge and the voice that, when she used it, he listened to with the same complete attention he had given her across her kitchen table from their very first real conversation. He told her once, in the particular quiet that the desert offered after midnight when the house was settled and the children were asleep, and the ranch was only the small sounds of a working place at rest, that he had not expected this. He said it in a careful way that meant he was choosing the words precisely. "I had thought about marriage," he said, "in the abstract way you think about things you know you should eventually do. I had not thought about it as something that would make me more myself. I thought it would require me to be less." She considered this seriously because he was being serious, and, "I was wrong," he said simply. "You do not ask me to be less anything. You ask me to be more everything. I find that I am because you are watching and I do not want to disappoint you." "You do not disappoint me," she said. "I hope not to," he said. "It is important to me." She turned to look at him in the darkness. "Clayton." "Yes." "I was afraid," she said, "for a long time after Edgar that I would not know how to trust again, not just a person but the whole arrangement, the vulnerability of it." "I know," he said. "I saw it." "You were patient," she said. "I had something worth being patient for," he said. She put her hand over his where it rested between them, and they lay in the quiet of the desert night with the stars somewhere above the roof and Martin and Alice sleeping in the rooms down the hall. And she thought about the word trust and all the specific ways it had rebuilt itself over the past years, grain by grain, the way the desert itself rebuilt after rain, slowly and completely, and with a thoroughness that made the thing that returned more solid than what had been there before. The following spring they made a trip to Santa Fe, the first time Rosa had been to a city of any real size since leaving the smaller towns of Texas as a young woman. She went with the open and observant attention she brought to new things, noting the sophistication of the streets and the variety of people on them, the evidence of a territory that was moving toward statehood with considerable intention, and she found it interesting without finding it better than what she had come to understand as her life. Clayton watched her looking at the city with the expression she recognized as him, monitoring whether she was going to want something different from the life they had built, and she turned to him at one point with the slight exasperation of a woman who knows exactly what her husband is doing. "I am looking at it because it is interesting," she said. "Not because I want it." He had the grace to look somewhat caught. "I know. You are checking," she said. "I may be checking," he allowed. "Silver Rock is where I want to be," she said, and looked at him directly so there was no room for misreading. "Specifically the part of Silver Rock that has a kitchen garden and a porch and 2 children and one large, difficult cowboy who cannot manage to be indirect about anything." He looked at her for a moment, and the smile came, the full one. "I am not that difficult," he said. "You are somewhat difficult," she said warmly. "I have adjusted to it." He took her hand on the Santa Fe Street in a way that was not entirely conventional for public comportment in 1888, and she let him, because convention was a thing she respected when it had a purpose and set aside when it did not. They had a good time in Santa Fe and came back to Silver Rock in the easy companionship of people who have traveled well together, which is its own kind of test, and which they passed without effort. Martin was 4 by then, and had developed a relationship with Harlan that Rosa observed with great amusement, the foreman having apparently decided that the boy was worth educating about the business of cattle ranching, and taking him along on appropriately safe portions of the daily work whenever the opportunity presented. Martin absorbed this education with the focused seriousness that she recognized, with warmth, as his father's, and the sight of the 2 of them, Clayton and Martin, moving through the corrals in the morning with the same particular way of carrying themselves, was one of the images she stored with great care. Alice, who was 2 and beginning to develop the terrifying confidence of a small person who has concluded the world will accommodate her, had taken a particular interest in the kitchen garden, and had accordingly been given a small plot of her own in the corner of it, which she managed with the imperial satisfaction of a person who has been given a domain. Rosa watched her daughter crouched over the small garden with a stick, investigating the soil with the expression of someone conducting important business, and felt the particular quality of joy that she had not known existed before it arrived, which was the joy of having made people, of having brought into the world 2 entirely specific individuals who were already themselves and would continue becoming more so. In 1889, when Martin was 5 and Alice was 3, Clayton came in from a full day of work on the eastern range looking tired in a way that was deeper than physical, and Rosa gave him time to wash and eat before she asked what was on his mind, and he told her that Harlan was talking about retirement. This was significant. Harlan had been with the McCrae operation since Clayton's father's time, and his leaving would require a reorganization of the ranch management that was not simply a matter of finding a replacement. "I have been thinking," Clayton said, "about promoting Denny." Denny, who had ridden out to Copper Creek years ago in a cloud of dust and nearly fallen off his horse in relief, had grown in the intervening years from an anxious young hand into a capable and trustworthy ranch manager in the making. Rosa had always liked him. "I think Denny is ready," she said. "I think you have been preparing him for it for 2 years without formally acknowledging that was what you were doing." He looked at her with the expression of mild surprise he sometimes had when she articulated something he had been doing unconsciously. "Have I?" "Yes," she said, "which means you already know the answer. You are asking me because you want to know if I see what you see." He was quiet for a moment and then, "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "Denny will manage this ranch well. Harlan taught him right." The transition happened over the following months with the deliberate care that Clayton brought to things that mattered, Harlan teaching and Denny absorbing, and the rest of the hands adjusting to a new order with the pragmatic acceptance of people who judged their foreman by his competence, which Denny had. Harlan stayed on in a reduced capacity, because the ranch was his life as much as anyone's, and because Clayton asked him to stay rather than insisting he go, which Harlan received with the gruff appreciation of a man who does not often feel properly understood. Rosa invited Harlan to Sunday dinner regularly that first year of his retirement from active duty, and he came and ate and sat on the porch with Clayton and argued about cattle market prices and the territorial politics with the comfortable vehemence of old colleagues. And she thought it was exactly right. This particular arrangement of people, this accumulation of connections that the ranch had gathered over the years, that she was now part of, and in some ways tended the way she tended her garden. With attention, and with the understanding that things grew best when they were given what they needed. In the spring of 1890, Martin started school, riding into Silver Rock with Denny in the wagon on mornings when Clayton could not take him himself, which was often. He took to it with the focused enthusiasm of a child who has been waiting for an institution that would give him enough to think about, and came home on the third day with the information that he intended to read every book in the school's small library. In what order? Rosa asked, because the question seemed relevant. Alphabetical, Martin said, with certainty. She looked at Clayton over Martin's head, and he looked back at her with an expression that said clearly, without words, that he was holding this moment close. Alice began school 2 years later and took to it differently, less interested in the books and more interested in the social dynamics of a schoolroom full of children, which she navigated with the strategic confidence of a small diplomat. Rosa received regular reports from the schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Fairfax who had come from Ohio with sufficient idealism to survive the practical realities of teaching in a territory school, that Alice was charming, that Alice was occasionally too much of a leader, and that Alice had ideas about how things should be organized that were not always aligned with the existing arrangement. Rosa received these reports with a specific mixture of suppressed amusement and genuine attention to the concerns that they described, and had conversations with her daughter about the difference between knowing the right way to do something and imposing that knowledge on others without invitation, which were conversations that Alice received with polite attention, and then implemented sporadically depending on whether the situation seemed to her to justify the imposition. She was, Rosa thought privately, exactly herself. In 1892, the territory was deep in conversation about statehood, and Clayton had opinions about this that were engaged and well-informed, and Rosa had her own opinions which were sometimes aligned with his and sometimes not. And the conversations they had about the political future of New Mexico were among the ones she most enjoyed, because he never assumed her position in advance, and she never assumed his. And the thinking through of it together was the kind of exercise that reminded her why she had never in her life wanted a husband who did not take her mind seriously. There were injustices in the territory that she was not willing to pretend away. The land that had become McCrae land and the land that surrounded it had been lived on by the people of the Mescalero Apache for longer than any settler could claim, and she had watched the steady displacement of those communities over the years with the specific discomfort of someone who is not comfortable but is complicit. And she said so plainly to Clayton one evening, because she did not believe in pretending toward comfort she did not feel. He sat with this, because it was worth sitting with. "I know," he said, and he meant it. "The land rights decisions that have been made," she said, "have not been made justly. The legal framework that gave your family title to this land was built on treaties that were not honored from the beginning." "Yes," he said. "I do not know what the right thing to do is," she said honestly. "I do not think we can undo what has been done, but I think we should not pretend it was done fairly." "No," he said, "we should not." There were no easy answers to this, and she knew that, and he knew that, and what she valued was that the conversation did not make him defensive or dismissive, that he held the discomfort of it with her rather than deflecting it, and that over the following years when there were opportunities to treat the neighboring communities with respect and fairness in practical matters, he took those opportunities seriously, not as absolution, but as the smallest available gesture toward decency. Martin was 10 when he told his father, with great seriousness, that he intended to study law. Clayton received this information with a face that Rosa watched very carefully and saw him manage with deliberate effort, because what was there, she thought, was the complicated feeling of a man who had always assumed his son would follow him in cattle and was now revising that assumption. But he only said, "Tell me why." And Martin told him, with the focused clarity of a child who has thought something through, that the territory's land problems required legal knowledge to solve, that the cattle business had enough people running it, and that he had been watching the boundary disputes and the title questions that Rosa and Clayton had worked through for years, and he wanted to understand the mechanism of them. Clayton listened all the way through, and when Martin was done he said, "That is a good reason. We will find you the best legal education in the territory, and when you know enough, you can decide what to do with it." Martin looked at his father with the expression of a child who has been prepared to argue and does not need to, and Rosa, watching from the doorway, felt the particular fullness of a moment that contained everything she valued most about the life she was in. The summer of 1893 was a good one, warm but not brutal, with enough rain in the spring to keep the range in reasonable condition, and the cattle operation turned its best profit in several years. Clayton suggested, in the straightforward way he had of suggesting things that other men would have proposed with more performance, that they might think about building a second porch on the south side of the house, which would catch the evening shade in summer and the afternoon sun in winter. She looked at him. "You have been thinking about this porch for a while," she said. "6 months," he admitted. "Why did you not say so? I was not sure you would want to change the house." She was quiet for a moment, understanding what he meant, which was that the house as it was had been built before her, and she had made it hers, and he did not want to presume she would want it changed without consulting her, which was the kind of thing he still did after 10 years, considered her preferences in the small and large matters of their shared life with an attentiveness that had never become perfunctory. "I would like a south porch very much," she said. They built it that fall, she and Clayton and Denny and 2 of the hands, and she was very much part of the building, not in a supervisory way but in the way of someone who wanted to put her hands on the work. And she thought that if someone had told her at 24, dragging a bleeding stranger across her dry yard, that 10 years later she would be building a porch on a ranch house in Silver Rock with that stranger's help and the help of the people they had collected around them, she would have found the prediction interesting and would not have known how to imagine the specific feeling of it. The south porch became, in the years that followed, the place where evenings happened. It caught the last of the day's light and let go of the heat ahead of the north porch, and she planted jasmine at its corners that grew slowly but with determination, and by the end of the decade had reached the roof line and in summer made the evenings fragrant. Martin went east to study law in 1899, at 15, which was young but which he was ready for, having exhausted the educational resources of Silver Rock and the tutors Clayton had been bringing out to the ranch for 3 years. He wrote letters home that were dense with ideas and observations and occasional complaints about the cold, which Rosa and Clayton read at the kitchen table with the attention of people who miss someone they love and are glad of the evidence of who that person is becoming. Alice, at 13, was the opposite of missing him. She occupied the full space of the family's attention without apparent effort and continued her strategic reorganization of Silver Rock's social dynamics, and the schoolteacher Miss Fairfax, who had stayed and made Silver Rock her home and was now Mrs. Caldwell, told Rosa that Alice was the most naturally confident young person she had encountered in 12 years of teaching, and meant it as a complicated compliment. Rosa received it as such. The turn of the century came to Silver Rock with the particular feeling of a threshold being crossed, not just a date, but a genuine sense that the world was different from the world that had existed on the other side of the number. The railroad was well established. The territory was moving toward statehood with increasing seriousness. The cattle industry was organized and sophisticated, and bore little resemblance to the rough and improvisational thing it had been when Clayton's father had driven 100 head into New Mexico 40 years before. Clayton turned 51 in 1901, and she threw him a party that was large enough to constitute a statement about how many people's lives had become entangled with his. And he sat in the middle of it with the mildly overwhelmed expression of a man who is not accustomed to being the center of attention for reasons unrelated to work. And she watched him manage it with the specific pleasure of knowing someone well enough to see exactly what they are experiencing beneath the composed surface. She danced with him after dinner on the south porch, with a fiddle player from town providing the music. And the jasmine was blooming, and the stars were doing what desert stars did, which was to make you feel appropriately small and appropriately grateful for the small brightness of the life you were standing in. And she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that the shape of her life had been made by things she had not planned for, and that this was not a loss but the truest possible gain. "Happy birthday," she said against his shoulder. "I am," he said, which was not what she had said and also was exactly right. Martin came back from the East in 1905, 21 years old and a fully qualified attorney, and set up a practice in Silver Rock that immediately became the most credible legal office in the territory, in part because of the McCrae name, and in part because Martin McCrae was genuinely good at it. He took cases that involved land rights and treaty questions with the focused seriousness he had brought to everything since childhood, and Rosa watched him work with the particular pride of a parent who has seen a child become entirely themselves. Alice, at 19, was moving through her own life with the confidence she had always had, and was being courted by a young man named Thomas Caldwell, the son of Miss Fairfax who had become Mrs. Caldwell, which Rosa found symmetrically satisfying in a way she appreciated without putting too fine a point on it. Thomas was a sensible, good-natured young man who had the intelligence to understand that marrying Alice McCrae would require him to be both confident in himself and flexible in his expectations, and he appeared to have made this calculation and arrived at a happy conclusion. Clayton watched Thomas with the careful attention of a father who is not hostile but is thorough, and said to Rosa one evening that the young man had the right qualities, which was the highest endorsement she expected him to offer, and which she understood as meaning that he trusted Alice's judgment, because he always had. Alice was married in the summer of 1906, in the church in Silver Rock, with a ceremony that was considerably larger than the small Copper Creek wedding Rosa and Clayton had had, because Alice had more people she wanted present, and the town of Silver Rock had grown to a size that could accommodate the reception comfortably. Rosa wore a dress she had made herself, because old habits are not always replaced, and some of them are worth keeping, and she stood beside Clayton in the front pew and watched their daughter walk up the aisle toward Thomas Caldwell with the unhesitating stride of a woman who has decided on something and is executing the decision. She felt Clayton's hand find hers in the pew, and she held it. This hand she had been holding for 23 years, and thought about all the ways a life could be the thing you did not plan for and could be, because of that, more completely itself than anything you might have engineered. That evening, after the reception had wound down and the guests had gone and Alice and Thomas had left for Santa Fe for a week, Rosa and Clayton sat on the south porch in the dark. The jasmine was at the peak of its summer abundance, and the air was heavy with it, and the stars were doing what they always did, and the ranch was settled into its nighttime sounds, and they sat together in the quiet the way they had been sitting together in the quiet for more than 2 decades. "She is happy," Rosa said. "She is," he agreed. "She has always known how to be." "She learned some of it from you," Rosa said. He turned to look at her. "How so?" "You decided to be happy," she said. "That day you came and knocked on my door in January and proposed like you were reporting a business decision. You had made up your mind that this was going to be good and you were going to make it good and nothing was going to be permitted to interfere with that. She does the same thing." He was quiet for a moment. "And you," he said, "did you decide to be happy?" She considered this honestly. "I decided to stop being afraid of it," she said, "which is different but amounts to the same thing." He reached out and found her hand in the dark, the familiar geography of it, and held it. "Rosa," he said, "yes, I have been thinking about something. Tell me." Another year or two, Martin will not need the practice to carry the McCrae name the way it does now. He is building his own reputation. He paused. And Denny has the ranch well in hand, has for years, and Alice is settled. And I have been thinking that there is some of the territory I have never seen in the northern part near the mountains that I have always intended to see. She was very still, listening. "I thought," he said, "that you and I might ride up there, just the two of us, take some weeks. See the country." She felt the thing that moved through her at this, the recognition of it, the generosity of it, that after all this time and all the building, his idea of what he wanted was simply to be with her in new country, looking at new things together. "I would like that very much," she said. "Good," he said. And there it was, that word, the same one he had said on a winter night when she had told him she was willing to be courted, the same word that carried everything he meant in its plainness. They left in September of 1907, just the two of them, with packed saddlebags and a pack horse and no fixed schedule, and a map that they looked at with interest but did not treat as law. They rode north through country that grew greener as the altitude increased, through stands of pine that were nothing like the scrub desert they had both grown up in, through mountain meadows where the grass was tall and the air was cold in the mornings, and the evenings smelled of everything that was not cattle country. They camped under stars that were lower and wider in the mountain air, and talked with the ease of people who have been talking to each other for 23 years and have still not run out of things to say, and were sometimes silent with the ease of people who have been silent with each other long enough that the silence is its own conversation. She watched him in the firelight on an evening 2 weeks into the journey, when they were camped in a meadow that neither of them had any name for, and thought about the first time she had watched him by firelight, the night he had been fevered on her cot in Copper Creek, when she had changed compresses, and listened to him talk about the eastern fence, and not yet known what the gray-green eyes looked like when they were clear and focused and directed at her with full intention. She had been nursing a stranger then. She had had no idea, in those careful, difficult hours, who he was or what he carried or where he had come from, and it had not mattered, because the only thing that mattered was that a person needed care, and she was someone who could give it. She had given it freely and without calculation, and what she had received in return was not payment for a service rendered but the whole and continuous gift of a life that was more than she had known how to want. "What are you thinking?" he asked from across the fire. She looked at him. The firelight moved over his face, and he was older than the man who had fallen off the horse, the gray in his hair that had not been there then, the lines around the gray-green eyes that went deeper than they had, and he was more himself than he had been in any version she had known, because that was what time did when it was spent well. "I am thinking," she said, "about the day you fell off your horse." He smiled. "I did not fall off." "You fell off," she said. "I made a controlled descent." "You fell off your horse onto my fence line and required a great deal of nursing." "I required some assistance," he conceded. "You required a great deal of it," she said, "and you were not gracious about accepting it at first, and then you were." He looked at her across the fire with the eyes that were green or gray depending on the light in which she now knew in every variation. "And what do you conclude from thinking about that?" he asked. She looked at the fire and then back at him. "That it is remarkable," she said. "That two lives that had nothing to do with each other can become so entirely part of each other that you cannot remember, not properly, what the one felt like without the other." He was quiet. The fire settled. Somewhere in the meadow the horses moved. "No," he said softly. "You cannot remember it. You can know it happened, but you cannot remember the feeling of it." "No," she agreed. "You cannot." She got up from her side of the fire and came around to his, and he shifted to make room for her, and she settled against him in the way she knew, shoulder to shoulder, his arm around her in the familiar shape. And they sat and watched the fire and the stars over the mountain meadow, and the night was cold and very still, and the life they had built together was complete and whole and still continuing, which was exactly what a life should be. They rode back to Silver Rock in October when the mountains began their turn toward winter, and the ranch came into view in the morning light after the long ride south. And it was exactly what it was: a working place, a home, a thing that carried their history in its walls and its corrals, and the garden that would need seeing to after their absence, and the south porch where the jasmine had gone dormant for winter and would come back in the spring as it always did. Martin was at the ranch when they arrived, having come from Silver Rock to be there when they got back, and he stood on the porch with a cup of coffee and the expression of a son who has been mildly worried and is relieved to see his parents looking well and in good spirits. "You look rested," he said to his mother. "I am," she said, swinging down from her horse with the ease of someone who had been riding for 3 weeks straight and had found her seat again. "The mountains agree with me." "They agree with her," Clayton confirmed, handing his horse to one of the hands. "We may have to make this an annual thing." "Good," Martin said. "Denny says to tell you the South Range fence held through September and the yield on the hay was—" "Tomorrow," Rosa said. "Tell him tomorrow." Martin looked at her, and then at his father, and the look he exchanged with Clayton was the look of a son who has watched his parents long enough to understand the language they use that has no words, and he nodded. "Tomorrow," he said. "Coffee's hot." They went in, and the house received them in the way of a house that has been lived in long enough to have absorbed the particular character of the people who live there. And Rosa put her bag down in the bedroom and stood for a moment at the window that looked out over the south porch and the yard and the ranch beyond, the land that had been hers by marriage and by work and by the daily choice to be present in it. She thought about a young woman who had stood at a much smaller window in a much smaller house and watched a stranger fall off a horse and had not hesitated, had simply gone. She thought about what going had cost her and what it had given her, and what the giving had turned into. She thought that she would do it again, every part of it, the 11 months alone and the nursing and the letters and the courtship in the cold desert winter. She would do it again without altering a single step, because altering a single step would alter all of it, and she would not trade all of it for anything the world had on offer. Clayton appeared in the doorway of the bedroom. "Come drink your coffee," he said. She turned from the window and looked at him, this man, hers, in the doorway of the home they had built. "Yes," she said, and went to him, and the door between them and the rest of their life swung open, and outside the morning was clear and cold and the desert was bright as a promise, and the south porch waited, and the jasmine waited to bloom again, and there was coffee and there was tomorrow, and there was everything that tomorrow contained, which was all of it still ahead and still theirs, and that was more than enough, and it was everything.